Alright, this is intended as an intro video, a little bit about myself, who I am, what I'm going to be doing with the channel, and go over the two decks that I have put together primarily to play. So I've been playing Magic off and on since like 96, 97. I've got a pretty large paper collection. I do really like playing Legacy, but with the pandemic, everything's kind of shut down right now, and I can't really play paper. I've dabbled over the years a little bit in MTGO, but never really done much with it because I don't like the idea of having to buy all the cards over again. So with paper play being pretty shut down, I can't really play with my cards anymore. So I've looked at budget ways to get into Legacy play, and one of the best decks for playing budget in Legacy appears to be some builds of Reanimator. I'm going to go over two different builds and play a league with one of them, or at least start a league with one of them. Um, Way back when, one of the very first actually good or decent decks that I built happened to be a Reanimator deck. I didn't know that was an archetype. I didn't know what archetypes were back at the time, but this was just sort of the first thing I put together that beat all my friends. And it used Buried Alive and Merfolk Looter to throw a benthic behemoth into the graveyard, and then exhume and animate dead to bring it back out, and then magical hack to change that island walk into planeswalk or mountain walk or whatever I wanted, and then I got to laugh at the thought of this uh, giant whale-looking thing flopping its way unhindered across the plains to land on top of my opponent's face. And all my friends hated it, and I loved it. And ever since then, I've always kind of had a soft spot for Reanimator decks. So this is a mono black Reanimator build. It's much more popular than it's much more popular in the Japanese scene than it is in the U.S. scene. Um, Even there, it's still kind of lately kind of taken a backseat to black-red type builds. The black-red builds are more explosive. This is a little slower, a little more controlling. Um, it does have some budget considerations currently in the deck. So the main deck is pretty well solidified. You've got some number of lands. There's a couple choices here that are a little off the two scrying sheets specifically. Um, I don't think the Japanese scene players do much with their lands other than just swamps and lakes of the dead. I could potentially look at swapping these scrying sheets for a Castle Lock Thwain, or just going back to regular swamps. Um, it's that one's a little bit up in the air still. Uh, right now, I'm running the scrying sheets because they only cost a couple cents as opposed to a couple of bucks with the Castle Lock Thwains. This whole deck comes in under 30 ticks on MTGO, which is under $30. So it is quite budget friendly. If you were to buy the whole thing in paper, it'd probably be about 500, largely because of these three Lakes of the Dead, which is still pretty reasonably cheap for a legacy deck. The biggest, most impactful uh, considerations for a legacy deck are in the discard. So I'm running 3 Cabal Therapies, 4 Duresses, and 2 Hymn to Taurox. If I was not playing budget, then the Cabal Therapies, well, probably all the Duresses and some of the Cabal Therapies, and probably both of the Hymn to Taurox, would turn into some mix of um, Unmasks, Thoughtseizes, and Collective Brutalities. There are 2 sort of flex slots available in the deck. Right now I've got those as Feed the Swarms. Um, Considering doing something like Sign in Blood or Night's Whisper to add a little more card draw. You can do, I've done in the past, Cling to Dust to give this like a sort of a cantrip, and that also helps a little bit in random situations. It gets rid of Urros, it gets rid of opposing Reanimator decks. It's good against Hogak. It's just a seems like a pretty decent cantrip that's available to a mono black deck. Right now I've got Feed the Swarm in there because that's the new hotness. Um, then there's the Reanimation package. So Entombs are one of the more expensive cards that you really can't skimp on for a Reanimator deck. There's really no way around an Entomb. It's kind of a unique effect, especially instant speed 1 mana. Yeah, Buried Alive just probably isn't going to do the trick. Reanimate, Animate Dead, and Exhume are all the reanimation spells, so there's 12 total reanimation spells between those 3. Um, you can shave some of those when you're sideboarding in certain situations, depending on how you're sort of altering the deck. Four Grave Titans and one Massacre Worm. So unlike the black-red versions, which are very all-in on the Gristlebrand plan and use four Chancellors of the Annex in the main to sort of protect that initial thing, the mono-black version is a little slower, a little more control-y, and wants to keep lines open like turn 3 using Lake of the Dead to hard cast a Grave Titan. The Massacre Worm versus the Elish Norn. So if I was going all in on a Gristlebrand plan, the main goal of the Gristlebrand is to get you enough cards to get something else into play to turn. So if Gristlebrand needs to swing for the kill, that's 3 hits um, at 7 damage apiece. If you give somebody 3 turns to pull out of it, there's a good chance that they will. So you're much more interested with Gristlebrand in getting more and more stuff into play. Whereas if you can get a turn 3 Grave Titan, you're kind of counting on that Titan to finish them off. Elish Norn versus Massacre Worm. Elish Norn is much more of a I want to get this card down to improve my Gristlebrand. I want to. So the main weakness of both Gristlebrand and Elish Norn is Karakas. These cards don't get hit by Karakas, basically. If Mono Black puts a Gristlebrand into play, it's planning to win that way. It's planning to get multiple threats on the board. If there is a Karakas out, then you kind of have to go for the Ashen Rider. I should have sort of put my thoughts on that down a little bit more. Anyway, long story short, I can actually hardcast a Massacre Worm and not get it bounced to a Karakas, which makes it a little bit better in the main deck than Elish Norn. But in certain situations where maybe Iona isn't that great, or I'm shaving Grave Titans, I could bring in the Elish Norn against like an Elves deck or something. Then Gristlebrand, only running one. You could potentially run a second. I don't know what you cut for it. Possibly the Iona. The Iona, the reason you've got Iona in your main board is that this deck is pretty weak to spell-based combo decks like Storm, and so you just need something to deal with that. Sideboard, you very often transition into a Pack Rat for your win condition because your opponent is going to sideboard very heavily to shut down your Graveyard Reanimation plan. And if they do that and you pick a hand with like a little Disruption and a Pack Rat, you can often just catch them unawares and swing for the win with rats. 2 toolbox creatures. The Chancellor is for spell-based combo decks, echo decks, things like that, to help the Iona, because sometimes Iona isn't enough to completely shut them down. Toxic Deluge is for basically any creature-based deck. It's just the best sweeper I can come up with. Tormod's Crypt and Nihil Spellbomb, those come in against some combo, but primarily like opposing reanimation decks and Hogak decks. Pithing Needles and Sorcerous Spyglass are just very useful in general. Primarily they come in against Depths combo and Knight of the Reliquary decks and decks that are largely focused on Planeswalkers. And then Ratchet Bomb is your answer for things like Grafdigger's Cage and Chalice of the Void. So that's the mono black deck. The black-red is not as budget-friendly because in black-red Reanimator, there's really no substitute for all the fetch lands. I haven't been able to find a budget substitute for that. Yeah. Dual lands online are pretty cheap because of one of the sets that they put out for MTGO exclusively. So those aren't too bad. But the fetch lands are fairly pricey. So while the mono black version comes in at about 30 ticks, this would come in probably around 100 to 150 ticks, I think. I mainly play the mono black version. This is just something for me to try out when the mono black isn't treating me very well and I want something a little bit different. This is much more all in on the combo. Try to get the combo as quick as you possibly can. The discard is pretty much the same, Cabal Therapies and Duresses. The reanimation is pretty much the same. 4 Entombs, 4 Reanimates, 4 Animate Deads, 4 Exhumes. The reanimation package is a little bit different. You have 4 Chancellors of the Annex to protect you against Force of Wills and to try to help you go off on turn 1 or 2. uh, to get around combo magic. Because you've got the Chancellors of the Annex in the main board, you don't really need the Iona in the main board. The Chancellors can gum up spell-based combo decks well enough, and because of that, you can run the Elishnorn. Um, Instead, you do run 4 Gristlebrand's. You don't really mind drawing a Gristlebrand as much because you've got Faithless Looting to get it back out of your hand. Uh, the There's an additional big budget consideration here, and that is Lotus Petals for Simian Spirit Guides. Lotus Petal is almost strictly better against just about everything as opposed to Simian Spirit Guide. There's occasionally times when the Spirit Guide can help you, um, such as it's concealed from a daze, so they may try to daze something when you've got this in hand. And then the other situation is that it's not actually casting a spell, so if there's a Thalia in play, you don't have to pay an extra for your Simian Spirit Guide, whereas to play out a Lotus Petal you would. Then in the sideboard, there's an additional budget issue, which is Reverend Silence. Is that what it's called? Um, anyway, it's a free green spell that wipes out all artifacts and enchantments. So for budget options, I'm using Serenities and Wear Tears. Those are just quite a bit better than the Ratchet Bomb solution that you have in the available in Mono Black. So it's nice to have extra access to those. Additionally, you have Red Elemental Blast to fight against blue decks, Xantid Swarm to try to resolve your stuff through hate, and opposing counterspells. I'm not sold on the one Grave Titan here in the sideboard. I think I could probably swap that for something else. It's pretty rare that I actually want to get that as my reanimation target. I've seen a lot of people run Magus of the Moon in there, but I'm not really sold on him either. I don't know what I want, so there's just kind of one flex spot in the sideboard as far as I'm concerned. Coffin Purge is nice against opposing Reanimator decks because you can entomb it. And then Archetype of Endurance and Iona. Archetype is again to stop Karakas from bouncing your Gristlebrands and your Elishnorns. Karakas is one of the biggest enemies of the deck. Unlike Swords, Swords is nice because it gives you back the life that you spent, most of the life you spent to get the Gristlebrand. So it's kind of like you get the card draw of the Gristlebrand, but the first one's free, and that usually gets you enough to fight your way back through and possibly reanimate another Gristlebrand. Whereas a Karakas bounces it without giving you the life back, so that can be pretty brutal and leave you very low on life and struggling for resources to keep going. One of the big problems with the budget builds, specifically the red-black budget build, is its ability to continue casting spells after getting Gristlebrand into play, the turn it gets Gristlebrand into play. So if you use all your mana to, like, Dark Ritual, Entomb, Exhume, or Dark Ritual, Duress, Entomb, Reanimate, or like on a end of go, like turn 1 Swamp, end of turn Entomb, and then untap Exhume or Reanimate or Animate Dead. Something that gets you a Gristlebrand into play, which is great, but you're left with no mana. If you have even 1 black mana available, you can use Gristlebrand to draw, try to get into a Dark Ritual, and then keep going. That's the case with both decks. If you've got 1 black mana available, you can keep going. If you don't, with the budget build, with Simian Spirit Guides, there's no way to draw into a black mana. No way that I know of, anyway. The non-budget builds can run Lotus Petals, and Lotus Petal is a free spell that lets you keep going. So yeah, that's one of the big concessions that you have to make as a budget deck, is sometimes you have to put Gristlebrand in play, draw some cards, pass the turn, and wait until the turn afterwards to really sort of go off, as it were. That covers most of the decks and a lot of the card choices. So, with all that said, I think maybe I stop the video now and then jump into a league and start a new video. So that'll make a good intro, I think. How long was that? Yeah, 15 minutes. That's a decent intro video for anybody who's interested. I'm happy to answer questions in the comments. I have a 5-0 league recorded with the mono black build that I can post. Yes, it does feel like sort of a lot of things went right to get that 5-0. It's my second 5-0 with the deck, and but I think the deck on a whole is kind of a break even or maybe slightly favored in the current meta. So it's certainly not a bad deck and one you can build for fairly cheap. Um, the budget red black, I've got a 4-1 recorded that I can post, and I may record future videos with it. Again, it's sort of like a, the mono black one just isn't feeling good at the moment and isn't drawing well, and I want to try something with a more explosive start and more redundancy with the faceless lootings. Um, but it is noticeably weaker than the mono black version feels very similar to a full budget build of the deck, whereas the budget red black version um, certainly feels noticeably weaker than the full budget version of red black Reanimator. So another thing that I would like to do is build my way into goblins. I am a good bit of the ways there. I need some ether vials, some caverns of souls, and some wastelands, and then and Muxus. But you can do goblins without Muxus. Goblins was around long before Muxus. Mindbreak traps are something that I could look to purchase and use in all of the decks. I think it's certainly helpful. Same goes for surgical extraction. That would fit in all the decks as a sideboard card. Um, yeah, so that's a little bit about myself, about the decks. I also have some box openings that I could do on channel. I sort of delayed creating this channel because I got a lot of things ready to go, and then Wizards put out their Walking Dead announcement, and I was just angry at Magic and angry at Wizards and didn't want to make anything for them. But I've cooled down a little bit. I still hate the Walking Dead thing. Please don't buy it. Even if you're like buying it to spec, I think it's a bad spec. That's all finance stuff. That's not what this is about. So, anyway, hope you enjoyed the intro. Hope you enjoy the future games on the channel. And if you have questions, feel free to ask.